Okay. Oh, good. The microphone has a battery now. That's so good. It's like been a week since they came in with a new box of batteries. I don't know what's going on. I'll have to remember. I stole one from the other lecture hall, so we should be good. Okay, and that will hopefully save my voice, which I feel like after shouting through most of my last class, I'm going to lose, which is awesome. Thank you, University of Alberta, for my annual laryngitis, which happens almost once a year. Okay. So, sadly, because I was sick, you didn't get to experience my deep and detailed way that I force people to grapple with what is on this slide, which anyone who's taken like half a dozen other classes with me, where I also use the Axe Body Spray Angel to do semiotic analysis, will say, I truly love this particular ad, and I'm sad that we missed analyzing it together. But moving on. Okay. Unless you would like to do it now. No, kidding. Anyone? No. Oh, that's loud. Wait. Haha. Haha. The mic is better. Very good. I forgot that this one was on. Oh, yeah. Okay. What am I talking about? I have no idea. Class dismissed. Good day. Except some of you came down here probably just for this class, and that they would be angry. I understand. No, I'm kidding. I'm in end of the term itis, and my brain is mush because the Dayquil is starting to wear off. So let's do this. All right. So last time, obviously, I wasn't here. Thanks for that. It made a difference to just sit in my house, order soup, and mark exams for sociology of youth. Which was still better than coming to campus and coughing and sneezing my way through the day. So, obviously we covered a bunch of the slides that I have for content analysis. Any particular questions before I jump into new content for the day? Perfect. Everything was perfectly explained, and you all have understood everything, which is the way I like to go. Okay, bless you. It's just like my engineering class this morning. You could have had like a Christmas song, just like with different people sneezing. It was just like kind of gross, to be honest, but it was funny because it's like achoo, bless you, achoo, bless you, achoo. Okay, I'm gonna stop. Okay, so I ended off those slides with hermeneutics, which I will not talk about again. You can go back and watch it again if you want. Okay, so we're talking content analysis, right? Especially when you get into sort of, the media studies part of content analysis. One of the questions that starts to get asked is about interpretations, right? And about how interpretation actually works. And particularly whether, the red is fine, right? I'm going to go with green. These colors are not red friendly. Much better. Okay. Whether audiences, like people who consume particular text, right? Readers, viewers, listeners, whether they, excuse me, accept interpretations at face value, or do they read with a critical kind of mind and evaluate, what they are viewing, reading, whatever, right? Whatever way you want to talk about a text, whatever they happen to be doing, right? Do they reinterpret what's written or what's on the screen or what they're looking at? So, generally speaking, when we talk about media studies or studying content, we've moved into a space probably, really since the 1980s, where we talk about active audiences, right? Where the audience is seen as active, where they're doing a lot of work, interpreting things, thinking through concepts through their own frame, and kind of reinterpreting things. Okay, so, this is true for social researchers, right? Social researchers interpret data through their own frame. So when you read it, let's say you're doing some kind of content analysis, right? you have to be cognizant of your own frame of reference, what your beliefs, ideologies are. If you were, say, looking at texts, right, in terms of meaning, you can never assume a single interpretation. Right? Because different people are going to read text differently. Okay, so any conclusion that you come to about any kind of content, right? Any particular, book, television show, diary, whatever. Well, now you can't see the green either. This slide has too many variable colors. Because like you can't see the orange there, can't see the green here. I've made a mess. This was not designed with my pen in mind. Okay, so any conclusions, right, are going to reflect the particular reader and not all possible interpretations. And with content analysis, you just have to keep that in mind, right? Here, I'll give you a word. This is Roland Barthes' word for describing it. He talks about polysemy, right? Or multiple meanings, right? So multiple kind of ways of reading any kind of piece of content, right? And so you have to be aware of that as a researcher. And if you're doing content analysis, right, you have to keep in mind that your reading as the researcher is probably only one of multiple possible readings of that particular text. Okay. So we're talking, oh my God, sorry. My throat is killing me. I apologize. So we talk about discourse analysis, right? We can talk about it in a couple of ways. One of them is anti-realist, right? Okay, sorry. We're moving to, sorry, I skipped ahead. We're going to move to something else. We're going to talk about discourse analysis, right? So discourse analysis is another type of content analysis, right? So it's looking at particular things that happen in text. Okay, so and you can think about, if you've done something like classic or contemporary social theory, and you've talked about like Foucault, right? Foucault very much is sort of the, I want to say the grandpappy, but I think our most, in sociology, our most sort of discourse analysis-y type theorist, right? Because he's really, really interested in how changes in the way that we talk about things change kind of social structures, right? So we can talk a little bit about discourse analysis and how it works. Okay, first thing, one of the kind of schools in discourse analysis is the, I guess you would say, kind of strong constructionist or anti-realist position, which says, right, there's no objective reality waiting to be found. No objective account of the social world is possible. Everything is discourse, and how discourse shapes our experiences, right? So all of our understanding of the world is shaped through language. Now, like I said, this is like your hard constructionist that we talked about at the beginning of the term, right? It's like everything is language, so we can never have an objective view of the world. So there's no objective world out there to discover, right? It's just all language and language games and power games, right? So this sort of anti-realist discourse goes towards a constructionist orientation. So when you're doing kind of discourse analysis or content analysis using this kind of really hard discourse analysis, one of the things, right, you would give priority to is the accounts of participants, right? Because what you're interested in is not the objective world. You're interested in the constructed world, right? So if you wanted to know about an event, you're not trying to find out about what actually happened. You're interested in finding out about how people constructed their own view of what happened, right? Because you're like, okay, there's no objective account of the social world to be found, just what people constructed. And again, this recognizes that different accounts are possible, right? That meaning is constructed different ways through different experiences, through different language tools, right? And at the extreme end, two people speaking different languages are going to see something in very different ways. And oriented to action, right? So thinks about the way that people are constructing their kind of view of the world through the discourses that they're employing, through the way they're talking about the world. Okay. So, discourse analysis in the Foucauldian sense. Okay, I'm going to talk about it a little bit differently. I've been rethinking how I talk about discourse analysis and Foucault. So, all right. So Michel Foucault, right? He's the 20th century French social thinker and theorist and philosopher. That really, I think, is the foundation of kind of postmodern thought, and one, definitely one of the foundational figures in kind of contemporary sociology. So, without giving you his biography, which is fun, he's really into BDSM, amongst other things. Extreme sadomasochism was kind of his jazz, but that's neither here nor there. It's just fun to talk about. So, one of the things that Foucault was really focused on, and Foucault did a lot of what you would call content analysis, right? Because he went back into historical texts and looked at how basically ways that people were talking shaped people's experiences, people's understanding of the world, what was possible to say, who had power, all of these sorts of things. And in the kind of extreme Foucauldian sense, you can think about discourses in a couple of ways. Okay, so the ability to shape discourses, right, to be the one allowed to speak, is power, right? Because you can include and exclude certain people or ideas from society. And discourse analysis, in a lot of ways, seeks to track these things. Okay, so there's a really interesting metaphor, and I was reading this again recently. It's a sort of from a Foucauldian, but one of the more comprehensible Foucauldians. So not Deleuze and Guattari, because those two are Foucauldians who I am convinced did a lot of mushrooms and then wrote their books. You know what I'm saying. Of 1,000 plateaus. Yeah, I got lost at some point reading Deleuze and Guattari when they start talking about language as rhizomes. And I'm like, okay, it's like a potato? Language is like a potato? I don't understand what these crazy people are talking about. I did eventually figure it out. It's been a while since I messed with Deleuze and Guattari. And I'm like, it would probably have been better if I'd been high when I tried to read it. If I had some of that classic Dayquil with pseudoephedrine in it instead of the crappy Dayquil they have now. That doesn't have the stuff you need to make meth. Okay. That's how I'm feeling. I'm like, I need my meth medication. That's what I want out of my day today. As my head gets fuzzier as I talk. Okay. Desserteau, one of the things that he talks about with discourses is he compares them to streets in a city, right? So you think of like a street in a city, right? Discourses direct us, right? They have indications of where you can go, what direction you're allowed to go, what you can say, what you can't say, right? How, what's proper, what's improper, right? Just like you move through a city, right? You follow the streets. It controls the way that you move. Streets control the way you move through a city. Discourses control the way you think, right? And what you can conceive, what you can't conceive. Now, occasionally people will, this is where the metaphor maybe breaks down or gets complicated. I'll try to draw a two-legged person this time. I drew a three-legged person in my last class. It was awesome. Sometimes, people will jaywalk. They'll challenge discourses by doing things that people don't approve of. But for the most part, discourses kind of shape how we talk, how we think, and there are things that you're allowed to say, not allowed to say. There are, things you're allowed to think and not allowed to think. And there are ways that these streets just shape what's even thinkable, right? Here, I'll give you an example. I don't know if it's a good one or not. So you see someone who's ranting in the street, right? And they're screaming at imaginary voices in their head. Because you live in a medicalized discourse, you think mental illness, right? Probably schizophrenia. But because that discourse didn't exist in the year 1380, what you would have said is demon. Right? And I don't say that to make fun of people in 1380. Right. Because the discourses they had, the way they thought about the world, the language and thoughts that were available to them, the way they were channeled through thinking by the available discourses, which were primarily religious, led them to that conclusion, right? Now, we have very different conclusions because we have a medicalized discourse, rationality, science, and all that jazz from the Enlightenment. So we think mental illness, right? So that's the way discourses kind of channel what is thinkable. And in a lot of ways, right, they tell us a lot of things like what's right. What's right? What's wrong? What's good? What's bad? What the meaning of things is. Like, okay, is my next slide? Okay, this one. Okay. I need a new magazine cover. I need to update this one. Can I tell you that when I chose this, and until like last year, I did not know who this was. Because I am a reject from pop culture. You all looking at me like I live on Mars. I did not know that this was Kim Kardashian. I was like, this is just, could be anyone on the cover. I know, and I never read it closely enough. I'm like, because I didn't know who that was, so it didn't mean anything to me. This is, again, what's that? Yes, isn't she though? And then someone pointed out this year that it looks like she's wearing a diaper, and I'm like, okay, I clearly need a new cover of Cosmopolitan. But I like this one. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, what discourses do you see on this magazine cover? No cheating. You've seen this already. You can't cheat. Actually, it's all good. Or if you tab ahead. Yeah, please. Oh, yes. So sex positivity. Which one do you see sex positivity? Okay. Maybe I'll show you mine and then okay, appropriate sexual conduct, right? Or sex positivity, right? Sex move that brings you closer, right? Like what do you do in a relationship, to bring you closer, right? Hashtag best night ever. Fucking love Cosmo, by the way. Because every time I see Cosmo, every single one of them, I think has this exact same article, right? Like, do they just reuse the same article? And does anyone read Cosmo consistently enough to even notice? That's my question. But I swear to God, every Cosmo has this article at some point. Okay, right? Why guys pull away and what to do when it happens, right? Acceptable male and female relationships, like, and what is it okay for women to demand of men, right? Okay. Oh, all right. We have our social norms related to beauty and how to be included in the group. How do you get along in a capitalist economy? 247 hot looks. Man, that is a lot of hot looks. Okay. That's neither here nor there. How can you fit 247 hot looks into one magazine? I have no idea, right? But it's organized rhetorically towards a purpose, right? There's an argument here. It's kind of hidden in a bunch of, plain sounding language, but it is orienting you towards a particular way of being in the world and telling you what the order of things should be. I scribbled a lot on this slide. Okay. I love my slides. So, okay, that's discourse analysis. Okay. Sorry. I feel you with that cough. Sorry. Oh, I'm wearing down. Okay. So, we talk about discourse analysis. Other things we can talk about is sometimes things are particular strategies are used for producing facts, right? For really driving home particular arguments. Not everything is Carrie Underwood singing about how she's better than you. So quantification rhetoric, right, can be a way of establishing sort of facts in a discourse. So if you want to, all right, let's say that you wanted to make an argument, right? You're rhetorically trying to set up something as true and therefore factual, right? One of the ways you could do this, and these are not all the strategies for producing fact, quantification rhetoric, right? So if we think of it rhetorically, you can kind of think of these together, right? Quantification. So if you give someone a number, right? I did this in my last lecture, right? It was like 37%, of American teenagers, have one to three caring adults, right? That's a quantification rhetoric, right? Because I'm saying, okay, I have this number. This is a quantity. It's about a third. That have, and this is not a real number. I messed up those numbers from my memory, but have 1 to 3 caring adults in their lives. So, is that good or bad? I'm making an argument with it, but having that kind of numerical backing gives it an air of validity, right? So, sorry, I just had a thought. I will tell you my thought because my brain is melting from the cold virus that is still attacking it. Do cold viruses attack your brain or another part? I don't know. So Mark Twain, because why not, had a saying that there are 3 kinds of lies, damned lies, and statistics. Kind of the same thing, right? If you want to back up something and make it seem more factual, you can use quantification. You can use like a statistic to back it up, right? Therefore, making whatever argument you're using seem more factual. Okay, use variations in numbers to highlight contrast. I think you can imagine how this works, right? I don't know. If you wanted to make the case that, okay, let's say, what's a plausible thing that you might want to make the case for? Canadians are happier than Americans, right? You could cite some number about anxiety fewer Canadians go bankrupt due to healthcare costs than Americans, right? I'm making up numbers. This is not true. 10 million Americans a year go bankrupt because of healthcare costs, and the number of Canadians is 5, right? Using a kind of variation in numbers is a kind of rhetorical strategy to support a discourse, attention to specific details to support evidence to the argument, right? I think you can imagine what that looks like. Donald Trump is orange, therefore Canada is better than the United States. I don't know. I'm being silly there. Orange presidents are objectively worse than non-orange presidents or prime ministers. That's probably not his worst quality. Why did I go with orange? I should have said erratic or insane. I have not gone on Twitter today. Did anything crazy happen? Did Putin and Trump get married yet? No, I don't know.
I'm pretty sure he suspended the tariffs for another month with Canada. Every time ceasefire. Oh yeah, he also canceled the ceasefire. Zelensky agreed.
Zelensky agreed?
Zelensky agreed. Now they're, I think, waiting for Putin.
No, sorry?
Now they're waiting for Putin.
Okay. Vladimir Vladimirovich. Okay.
Yeah,
oh.
It's all the same files every time. There was 2,000 PDF documents. I went through 20 of them last night.
Yeah, my friend sent me an article that summarized them, in which I concluded, dear God, there's nothing here. Why did anyone care about this? Which was my reaction to it to start with. I'm like, anyway. I didn't go on Twitter today, so I don't know what's happening in the world. My point, I don't know what it was. Like I said, my brain is melting as the Dayquil wears off. Okay, yeah, so attention to rhetorical detail, sensitivity to the way the argument is constructed, right? So if you look at how an argument is constructed, how convincing arguments are made and how they discount counter arguments, like we can look at all of these things in discourse analysis, right? Okay. if you have any questions, do you have any questions? I know I'm going through this quickly, but I'm sure you've all talked about discourse analysis a million times in sociology. I just want to talk about Twitter. Okay, critical discourse analysis. All right, let's talk about critical discourse analysis. So if we talk critical discourse analysis, right, generally is meant to expose like politics in the political nature of the examined text, right? So to kind of, I was going to use a word, but now it's escaped my brain, which is clearly falling apart. Expose. I was going to say another word. I'll just say expose, right? Brain melting. I'm sorry. So basically, if you're looking at a statement and you're doing critical discourse analysis, you're like, you're asking the question, whose power does it serve, right? Who does it make powerful and who doesn't it make powerful, right? Who does it undermine? Whose discourses does it elevate? How does it serve power, right? How is it inside a power hierarchy supporting that thing? So, I can't even think of an example off the top of my head. So things like power hierarchies, structural inequalities, right? If you looked at something like a lot of economics arguments, right, they might hide a bias towards neoliberalism, right? Or ways that it, creates inequalities for the poor or working class or these sorts of things, right? Or you can look at how it's integrated into historical political struggles. Sometimes these have a particular social justice focus in terms of really exposing the powerful and sort of showing how their power is unjust, right? That it's unjust, that it's been used poorly, and that it has basically, served a particular group at the expense of others. Actually, you know what? If we want to talk about critical discourse theories, one of the ones that often gets talked about is critical race theory, right? Critical race theory will often talk about things like, whiteness, and look at particular discourses and how they elevate, white people, white values at the expense of other groups. And always the goal with CRT is that kind of social justice focus to break down, what CRT theorists would call white supremacy. So, all right. I want to get out of discourse analysis. Okay, conversation analysis. Hang on, I'm going to check how many slides I have left. Sorry, my head is getting very foggy. All right, I have a few slides left. We'll see how we do. Maybe when we get to the end of this, instead of talking about mixed methods, I will just stop. Because I feel like I'm making less sense as time goes on. I don't know if that's true, but my head is starting to pound. So, but I don't want to come back and do content analysis next week. So, soldier on I shall. So, conversation analysis, right? So conversation analysis, totally different form of content analysis altogether, and we can leave behind discourse analysis and semiotics and all of that stuff. So conversation analysis, I think, is really typical of like linguistics. We see it a lot in linguistics. We don't see it as much in sociology. It certainly is there, but it's not sort of one of the dominant content analysis approaches. So what do you see when you talk about conversation analysis? It's basically looking at how talk is structured, right? How when people talk to each other, when they're having a conversation, how certain tools that they're using, certain ways that they speak, structure that and structure kind of relationships between people. Okay, so it'll talk about things like indexality. So things like pauses and sounds have meaning that depend on the context in which they exist, right? So if you were doing content analysis, conversation analysis. I got to move away from content analysis as the general frame. Conversation analysis, and you were listening to people speak, right? A particular sound can have different, or particular word, particular sounds, or pauses can have different meanings. So, for example, the sound right? In one context, it could mean I'm thinking and I'm not sure how to answer, so I'm using this as a pause in order to kind of gather my thoughts. So you ask me a question, and I'm like, well, the thing about it is, I'm kind of pausing. In another context, right, when you're talking about that same sound, someone could make a statement and they're like, I think we should all back the idea of Alberta becoming the 51st state. And you might be like, right? That same sound has a different kind of meaning. So conversation analysis would look at things like sounds, like participles, the way people speak, intonations, as things that have meaning depending on the context that they're used in. And the context is that specific conversation. Pauses, right? People pausing for particular reasons can have very different meanings depending on the context as well. Okay. And then reflexivity in conversation analysis examines how social order is created through communication, right? So, I think I have, I thought I had it on the next slide. So social order, like hierarchies, right? How we use communication, kind of conversations to determine, particular people's positions, particular people's roles in those kind of conversational settings, right? So what they'll say is any kind of conversation that someone walks into, that social order is not, a pre-existing phenomenon that you uncover, but it's actually being created in that conversation, right? As people are talking, that you're going to move through conversations and people are going to establish their dominance in conversations, their kind of level of knowledge, and all sorts of things like that in how they speak, the kind of language they use, the way they treat other people in the conversations. You end up in a sort of social hierarchy, right? Either it can be, a competitive one, right? So if you're at the bar with your friends and you're arguing about something, about, I don't know, let's say a political issue, or, who's the greatest hockey player of all time, right? You're going to have a very different dynamic. Like that social hierarchy, you would probably find is one of equals kind of talking of friends, right? However, in this class, if you were to do a conversation analysis of this class, you would determine that I talk too much. No, that's my job, right? But that I am, in charge, right? I have the highest position because I have the most words in the class. Not necessarily the best or most succinct words, but certainly in terms of volume, the most of them, which was absolutely a perfect sentence. Okay, so generally speaking, right, conversation analysis fits into a qualitative perspective, right, or a qualitative research tradition, although at times conversation analysis can also be done from a quantitative perspective. It's a little bit different when you're doing quantitative content analysis. You're generally like doing things like counting words, counting, sometimes you might do like what I was just saying. You count how long people are speaking and you try to establish kind of social hierarchies from that, how many times phrases or words are used, that kind of thing. Okay. And again, conversation analysis, it's contextual. You're trying to understand a particular social context. So it's got that constructionist ontology, but it's supposed to be very naturalistic in the sense that, you're getting your data from a real situation. Conversation analysis, generally when you're doing it, it's real conversations that you're wanting to analyze between people. Okay. So it does, like I said, it does, I get ahead of my slides sometimes. It does have links to quantitative research traditions, right? Because you're looking at fine-grained details of kind of conversations and talk. You analyze the structure, right? So you might analyze things like how often people speak, for how long they speak, that sort of thing in conversation analysis. So it can at times have a positivist orientation on replicability, right? You try to apply the same tools to different contexts and different conversations to try and replicate similar results. And yeah, when we talk about context in the case of conversation analysis, it's the conversation in particular rather than the broader social context, right? So you're not talking about like, okay, on March 19th, it was a day where Trump delayed the tariffs again. And that was what was happening. It's like, no, we sat down, Reg and I, and we were talking about, how something or other, I don't even know. My imagination is falling apart. What were we talking about earlier? Oh, the classes that you're registered in. Yeah, the classes you're registered in for next year. So just that particular context would be considered just what was said in that conversation rather than the broad context. Okay. I almost wrote with the back of my pen. Assumptions. Talk, the way people talk is structured, and you can tell things about, power dynamics from different ways that people speak. It's forged contextually, right? So things aren't predetermined, right? It's in the context of speech that social hierarchies are constructed within conversations, and the analysis you conduct should be grounded in the data, right? Okay. I don't want to rush you out of here. My brain is just hurting. Okay, we've got 3 slides left. So, conversation analysis. I'm going to make a comment. When you talk about content analysis in this format, it makes content analysis sound really, really boring. Content analysis is actually super duper fun. When it's done correctly and when you do it on something interesting, it's not this dry. This makes it sound very, very dry. But content analysis is not dry at all. And unfortunately, when you structure it in a class on methods, it's a class? Am I having a stroke? Oh my God, it's just a bad day. Okay, when you put it in a class on methods, right, it can sound really, really dry to talk about content analysis, but it's actually really interesting and fun. And like discourse analysis, like we saw in our Carrie Underwood song, it can be really, really fun. And you can have a lot of fun with this stuff as an academic discipline. It doesn't have to be boring, but when you talk about it in terms of social methods, it sounds really dull. So I apologize. Maybe I'm just not coming up with great examples today. I didn't have a single furry joke today. And it's too late because I can't think of one in terms of conversation analysis. Wait, no. All right, let's just finish up. So when we talk about conversation analysis, if you were talking about things like how talk is organized, you can talk about things like turn taking, right? Conversation's a back and forth process, right? Where I say something, you say something, I say something, not in the context of this class. I say everything, you say nothing. But in general, there's kind of back and forths. And conversation analysis would look at things like how long people's turns are, how much they say during their turn. Is their turn being interrupted by the other person, right? And you can learn things about social relationships from that. Adjacency pairs, right? How talk moves between parties, question and answer, right? Who's asking questions, who's answering questions, what stuff looks like. Preference organizations, what happens when you get a preferred response versus a non-preferred response, right? So I ask someone, let's say I ask my wife, hey, do you want to go out for dinner? And she's like, well, she says yes, right? Then it's like, I wanted to go out for dinner. So she says yes. And I'm like, okay, that proceeds to another question. Where do you want to go? Right? But if she gives me like, no, I feel like staying in tonight, then it's like, oh, well, you got the non-preferred response, requires a justification. Well, why don't you want to go out? Is something wrong? Or, you ask someone out on a date and they're like, no, I'm good. And then it's like, oh, well, why? Why don't you want to go on a date? Oh, I'm busy that day, waxing my goldfish or washing my hair, right? Whatever. I don't know why waxing my goldfish is always my example of things that people would use as an excuse not to do something. Because why would you wax a goldfish? It makes no sense. Or me, I need to wash my hair that day. That's also one of my favorite ones. My furry costume is at the dry cleaner, so I can't. I don't know. Oh, there, I got one in. Okay. Conversation analysis, right? The washing my hair joke is what really got you, isn't it? Oh, okay. Cultural context, explain. All right, so talk is structural, right? It's a structural analysis of talk, right? So you're trying to break down talk into structures like turn-taking adjacency pairs, preference organizations, all of these sorts of things, right? So it examines, the structure and history of the talk itself, but not, so, I asked my wife if she wanted to go for dinner, and she said no, and then I made her justify it, and then she got mad at me, and we ended up talking about something else, right? And we got into a fight about it. You look at the history of that, how everything started in the fact that I wanted to go out for dinner, not like, the history of the broader context. All right, it's time to bring content analysis to a close. So, what are the advantages of context analysis? And I realize that I've wandered into a slide where I have the worst pen color of all time because everything's orange. Okay. Content analysis. Super transparent, right? Especially in its quantitative form, and therefore really easy to replicate, right? You can tell people what you did. The methodology is really easy to explain and therefore easy to replicate. You can do longitudinal analysis, right? You can go back in time. I guess like content analysis, right? You can go back in time. You can go find a New York Times article from 1957, right? You can go back and then you can follow, discourses or particular social problems for a long time. And you don't have to have started 25, 30 years ago. You can start your longitudinal analysis today and move backwards into the past as long as you have content to analyze. It's unobtrusive, right? There is no reactivity. Because there are no people involved. The people wrote things down and then they disappeared from history as far as you're concerned, right? So there's no reactivity. It's flexible, you can use it with lots. And it overcomes social barriers to research access because you're using content rather than people. And let's add another one. No ethics, yay. You don't have to apply for ethics if you're doing content analysis because anything that you access is going to be broadly available. So there's no people. You're not dealing with people. So no ethics. Happy days. Another smiley face for you. That's a deformed smiley face. That's Quasimodo right there. I'm going to erase that monstrosity. It's actually surprisingly hard to draw with this stylus. I'm not going to lie. That's why I ended up with a three-legged person last class. Try that again. Bigger smiley face. Better. That one's not deformed. There we go. He's happy. And he has a little bit of hair. Okay. All right. So, disadvantages. Yeah, so there are limitations, based on the text analyzed. What's available to you? There might be things that aren't available to you, but then there's questions of like the availability, the authenticity, the credibility, and how representative it is. If you have more than one person, or even you're doing it by yourself, there's typically some intercoder or intracoder unreliability. It's a little bit subjective, right? You can have conjecture. And the critique of content analysis is that it's super subjective, right? It really is kind of up to the person interpreting it to come up with their interpretation, and no one else really has to agree. And other people come up with different interpretations and often do, and then people just fight over their interpretations of the content. Difficult to answer why questions using this method. It can be, right? It's easy to answer the what. It's hard to answer the why, but not why. And I mean, part of it is, as Roland Barthes said, the author is dead. So once you kind of start analyzing content, unless you actually have access to the person who created it to ask them what they meant by it, basically you can't explain the why, you can just kind of explain the what. So like you can give what you see as the meanings, but you can't say for sure why the person created them unless you have some other source, like you interviewed them or there's an interview with them. Okay. It can be a little bit theoretical at times, right? So there. Okay. How do we feel? Do we want to stop? No. I see. Okay. I'm good. I have a pounding headache, and I will try to return next week without it. Okay. I think there was one kind of thing I needed to mention about the mini lab. For whatever reason, I had taken off the mini lab the mock interview portion. I think it's really valuable for you to just ask those questions to someone. So I meant for it to be there. I will put it back in, and please just like ask your questions to someone. It does not have to be like, you don't have to find someone who actually is like an expert on whatever you're thinking. I just want you to, it can be your roommate, your significant other, the owner of the pet shop down the street. They can role play. Why did that incite the giggles? I don't know. But I'll put it back because you're just like wandering down the street to a pet shop to be like, would you answer my questions for an assignment? I just want you to test your questions and see if they work. So that person can completely role play. Like if you're wanting to pretend that they're like a Hell's Angel, right? Don't actually go find a Hell's Angel to interview. What's that? Just be like, hey, Dad, could you pretend to be a Hell's Angel and answer these questions for me? And then, your dad could be like, all right, ready to go. That sounds like Hulk Hogan. Anyway, so that's my intention. I'll make sure to put that back in, and I'll put an announcement on Canvas.
There was also yesterday's lab during the morning. We also kind of somebody asked the question of if the last thing we should be doing is a paragraph on reflections.
Yes.
And then apparently the assignment doesn't say paragraph. Was it?
No, that it does not say. It says mock interview in the actual mini lab vibe segment, but it does not say anything about a reflection.
Okay, I will put that back. Yeah, because the reflection, all you have to say is like, hey, I learned that question 5 sucks, right? Like that's all. I'm not looking for like you to reconstruct the process and be like, as I was moving through, I realized that my tone. No, it's just like, okay, question 2 and 3 don't work, and the flow is off, and I didn't like this question. That's it. That's all I'm looking for. But I'll make sure to put that back in. All right, I'm going to turn off my microphone because I am tired of being mic'd up, and I have like 3 of them on right now. So
I have an easy question for you.
Great. I love easy questions.
Because you do SOC 444, right?
Yes.
I forgot your last name. Like, I didn't do that.